Good morning, everybody. This is a live extreme weather briefing with a lot to talk about this Thursday morning. I shot some drone footage last night of these wildfires across Colorado, actually 3 different wildfires. The Williams Fork wildfire was the smallest one. That one's closest to I-70 up in the mountains. And also you could see the Cameron Peak fire off to the north and the Mullen fire up near the Colorado-Wyoming border that has absolutely exploded up near 100,000 acres. And these wildfires have been sending their smoke plumes off to the south-southeast across the Front Range of Colorado, reducing the quality of air out here definitely. And it's extremely dry across the Front Range, although last night we had a cold frontal passage that came through, which has temporarily improved the air quality across the Front Range. And it looks like there is a pattern shift that's going to be happening near the middle of October. So that's going to be about 10 to 12 days or so. There's going to be a wet pattern that's going to come in across the western and the northwestern U.S., bleeding in to the Colorado Rockies, cold, wet type of a pattern. Definitely a hostile environment for these wildfires. So a breath of fresh air is going to be coming here in about 10 to 14 days, starting first across the Pacific Northwest, up in Oregon, California, where they really need the rainfall the most out there. And then that pattern shift is going to sweep across the Rockies. So that's pretty good news. But there is some bad news out there as well, and it looks like the tropics are starting to reinvigorate once again, and that's what we're going to be discussing so far today. The reinvigoration of the tropics starting in the Western Caribbean, and in fact the tropics are already reinvigorated now in the Eastern Tropical Pacific with Hurricane Marie out there that has max sustained winds of 105 miles an hour, and it's forecast to become a Category 4 storm in the next 24 hours. In fact, it's going to be a Category 3 later on today. But this is the development region that we're watching here in the Western Caribbean into the southwestern Gulf of Mexico. And this is what we've been talking about for a while. There's a Kelvin wave that's propagating across the tropical Pacific that's associated with an uptick in the convection. Hurricane Marie is a product of that Kelvin wave that's propagating from west to east. Basically a piece that has broken off from the Madden-Julian Oscillation, which is anchored over the Indian Ocean right now with that larger blob of enhanced convection. But these smaller blobs are breaking off of the main blob there over the Indian Ocean and propagating across the entire Pacific despite the La Nina conditions that are out there, which is a pretty hostile pattern for convection across the Pacific. And despite that, you're still getting a powerful hurricane, Hurricane Marie, that's forecast to be a major hurricane by tomorrow morning. In fact, a major hurricane by later today as a Category 3 and a Category 4 by tomorrow morning, and it's definitely rapidly intensifying. And that blob of enhanced convection is going to continue propagating east, and eventually it's going to find itself here over the Western Caribbean, and that's going to be associated with the development of a Central American Gyre. And you may remember that intense cold front that we had here recently with those northerly winds surging all the way south through the southern high plains, through the Gulf of Mexico, and through the Bay of Tehuantepec here. So strong northerly winds getting funneled through the Gulf of Mexico into the tropical Pacific there. That strong northerly flow is funneled between a gap in the terrain there into the Bay of Tehuantepec, and that helps encourage a general area of cyclonic flow across this area. And you also have 2 tropical waves that are approaching from the east. The lead one is in the Western Caribbean already. And once these tropical waves arrive into the Western Caribbean, you've got this Kelvin wave approaching from the east. Everything's arriving in this region to support the development of at least 1 or 2 tropical cyclones, maybe more, and a couple of those could even migrate up into the Gulf of Mexico, as being hinted by the forecast models. But this is why the National Hurricane Center has increased the chances of development over 5 days with this lead wave. And I think that this lead wave is eventually going to find its way into the Gulf of Mexico as a tropical cyclone. Most of the models show it as a weaker storm, just meandering about in the Gulf of Mexico, likely to make landfall somewhere across the central Gulf Coast, maybe around October 7th through 8th type of a time frame. The European model, on the other hand, takes a further south track and causes this lead wave to dissipate over the Yucatan Peninsula. But the GFS, including the GFS ensembles, take a further northern track, a stronger, more organized tropical cyclone moving into the Gulf of Mexico. And that could cause problems across portions of the Central Gulf, depending on how that evolves. Most of the models, though, have a weaker storm. The GFS, though, has hinted at a stronger solution coming into the Central Gulf of Mexico, whereas the European weakens that system over the Yucatan Peninsula with that further south track. And many of the models have shown that this second wave that's further off is going to be the more formidable one as this arrives into the Western Caribbean around October 8 or 9, that type of a time frame. And that would bring it into the Gulf of Mexico around October 10 to 12 if it does curve off to the north. And there is a chance that 1 or 2 tropical cyclones are going to be born from this Central American gyre that's going to develop here across Central America into the Western Caribbean, into the southern Gulf of Mexico. And even though none of the models are showing it right now, I do think that there is a chance of a formidable tropical cyclone getting born from this pattern as well. But as I mentioned, we've already got Hurricane Marie that is out in the Pacific right now. And I'm going to pull up the Radar Omega app here and show you what that hurricane looks like. And it has maximum sustained winds already of 105 miles an hour. You can definitely see a hint at an eye starting to form in here as this central dense overcast is so intense it's leading to pockets of subsidence here in the inner core. And I do expect a well-formed eye to form out of on satellite here with Hurricane Marie. That is forecast to become a Category 3 storm later on today. You can see it's extremely symmetric as well. Perfectly circular central dense overcast or inner core here. Little pockets of subsidence developing near the center of it and propagating around each other, basically like a pinwheel in there. But eventually the subsidence is going to dominate. It's going to create a perfectly circular eye as it moves off to the west-northwest. The good news with Hurricane Marie is that it's going to be in the middle of the open ocean. It's not going to cause any problems except for shipping routes out there. Eventually it's going to die over the more stable conditions and the cooler ocean temperatures as it gets off to the north, but not before it reaching a Category 4 strength in the next 24 hours. And by this time tomorrow morning, we're going to see some incredible satellite imagery of Hurricane Marie. I can loop this satellite as well and show you the evolution of this beautifully symmetric storm. It does look like the center is moving just a little bit south of the forecast track, but that really doesn't matter too much since this storm is not going to be impacting land. As I mentioned, 105 maximum sustained winds. That central pressure is out to 973 millibars. And later on today, by this evening, it is forecast to be a Category 3 storm. Might even reach Category 4 status already by tonight. And that's going to continue that west-northwest movement. And as I mentioned, Hurricane Marie is at least correlated with a Kelvin wave that is propagating across the Pacific. We've been tracking it since our last update as well. And Hurricane Marie is associated with that area of enhanced convection that's propagating across the Pacific, and that's going to arrive into the Western Caribbean by the end of this week, by tomorrow, through the weekend. And that's when we're going to be watching the Western Caribbean near the Yucatan region for the development of another tropical cyclone. But one interesting thing are you can see these gravity waves coming out of that convective explosion near the center of Hurricane Marie. Look at those gravity waves propagating out from the center. And that's what we're trying to measure with our subsonic sensor. We're trying to measure those really fine scale pressure waves. Some of those occur on the longer frequencies as well. We're also trying to measure the infrasound frequencies by these storms. And these waves inside the atmosphere we describe as basically the heartbeat of these tropical cyclones. And with our network of subsonic sensors, we'll be able to track these individual waves. We're also able to track those pressure whipsaws inside the eye wall and the outer bands of these tropical cyclones, including those tornado-like vortices that are responsible for extreme damage within these hurricane zones. Hurricane Sally came in as a Category 2 storm in the central Gulf Coast from Gulf Shores through Pensacola Beach. And we definitely noticed very fine-scale tornado-like tracks that were whipping through the general severe damage, but you could find pockets of extreme damage within that where you could definitely see tornado-like vortices that were whipping through the northern eye wall, and we were definitely able to measure those and track those. But once we deploy a network of subsonic sensors ahead of these storms, then we're going to be able to triangulate those individual pressure whipsaws. We'll be able to track these larger scale gravity waves too that can propagate hundreds of miles away from where they're initiated, and it appears that these gravity waves are being initiated by a convective explosion right near the center of Hurricane Maria. And another tool that we're hoping to have ready in time for a hurricane intercept, potentially near the Gulf, would be the Sarginator. That's our storm surge sensor that Mark has been working hard on developing, and I'm going to show you that design, including the schematic for deployment that we have planned. I'm going to be looking for those stilt homes out there for the most part. We're going to need to get permission, of course, but I'd love to mount the storm surge sensor on those stilts that often are left behind. Even though the structure can sometimes be obliterated by these tropical cyclones, including the storm surge, usually those stilts are left standing. So the plan is to mount the Sarginator. That'll include a long wire that can stretch up to 40 feet from the sensor that will be below water to a pack that's above water, and it uses basically the pressure or the weight of that depth of storm surge flooding that's coming in to measure the depth, and also factors in the salinity and other properties of the water to determine how deep that is. But I'm going to show you that just a little bit later. But all we need is a tropical cyclone making landfall here toward the middle of this month, and the Sarginator will be ready by about October 8 or 9. So if this lead tropical cyclone develops in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a chance we won't have the Sarginator ready. But if the second wave comes in, then that one's a more formidable hurricane that we're able to intercept, and we'll definitely have it ready to go. So here's the 3D product here on Radar Omega, so we can view the inner core of Hurricane Maria in 3D. And you can also see those gravity waves propagating out from the convective explosions that happened overnight last night. But you can see that little pocket of subsidence that looks to be just north of the center. That could be the eye that's developing, but I think that the actual center is just a little bit south of that pocket of subsidence, and it'll probably wrap into the center of this hurricane. We'll have another convective explosion, increased subsidence in the center, and then we should see a perfectly clear stadium effect type of an eye by this emerging by later today. But these 3D tools are an awesome part of the Radar Omega app to view the high resolution satellite. There's also 3D tools in terms of radar. There you can see the official forecast track from the National Hurricane Center. So you can also use these tropical tracking tools to track where these hurricanes are going to go. And again, there you can see it's forecast to reach a Category 4 by tomorrow morning. So by the briefing tomorrow morning, we're going to see an incredible satellite image of Hurricane Marie. We'll be monitoring that all day tomorrow, and then the system's going to weaken as it passes over the colder waters just a bit further north in the subtropical Pacific there. But it's been a pretty convectively inactive period over most of the Pacific because of the development of La Nina conditions, or below normal sea surface temperatures in the tropical Pacific. That leads to increased wind shear across that basin. A decrease in wind shear, on the other hand, though, across the Atlantic, and that's why we've had, in part at least, the record-breaking season so far. So now, using the Radar Omega app, we're going to go back to the Caribbean and focus on these two tropical waves that are about to could develop into tropical cyclones. The lead wave could happen as early as this weekend. But really quick, I'll show you also this forecast track. Official forecast track for Hurricane Marie, forecast to weaken and stay out over the open ocean there, but it is forecast to become a major hurricane by the end of today, and a Category 4 as early as tomorrow morning. And here is the tropical wave, the lead tropical wave that we are monitoring so closely, and that could develop. In fact, the National Hurricane Center thinks it's likely to develop into a tropical cyclone as early as this weekend. The GFS also shows that meandering in the Gulf of Mexico for a couple of days. It doesn't yet show a powerful tropical cyclone in the open Gulf, but it definitely is a possibility even this late in the season. These Central American Gyre patterns are notorious for initiating hurricanes in the late season. But here you can see the lead tropical wave that we're monitoring. And this is initially on the GFS. As I mentioned, the European has a further south track for this lead wave, dissipating that tropical cyclone over the Yucatan. Here you can see the winds that are funneling through that gap in southern Mexico into the Bay of Tehuantepec, helping to encourage the formation of a large-scale gyre, or a vorticity maximum, and there's going to be little vortexes within that that will propagate around the gyre. Some of them could become dominant tropical cyclones. Some of them will weaken over the land here. Some of them may even form in the far eastern tropical Pacific, as are indicated by some of these models. Then there's another wave to the east of the Lesser Antilles that's going to be coming into this zone. And all of this is associated with a Kelvin wave that has propagated across the Pacific. It's in the eastern Pacific now. It's arriving in this zone. You have the development of the Central American Gyre. You had that cold frontal passage with the wind getting funneled from north to south into the Bay of Tehuantepec. And then you have the arrival of these tropical waves that are approaching from the east, easterly waves. And you can obviously see that these are cyclonic. You've got the southerly component flow on the east side of the wave, slightly northerly component flow on the west side of the wave. And this right now is just an open tropical wave. And it's not going to forecast to become a tropical depression until this weekend. And the GFS takes a further north track, which would minimize the interaction with land, whereas the European takes a further south track over the Yucatan, and that land would cause that tropical cyclone to dissipate. But this is the wave right here, loaded on the east side as they often are, and it will not form a tropical cyclone until Hurricane Hunter aircraft or other OBS can verify a closed circulation, and that involves measuring that westerly component wind to close up that circulation, and then it's going to be named officially a tropical depression. But this is the easterly wave, the lead one that is approaching here, moving through the Caribbean Sea, and once it approaches this zone right here, it is forecast to develop into a tropical depression, and then will likely meander with weaker steering currents into the Gulf of Mexico. And after that, anything is in play. The entire Gulf of Mexico is going to need to keep an eye on this storm. And then the next wave is going to arrive too, and I think there could be 3 tropical cyclones that form from this Central American Gyre, including down into the eastern tropical Pacific. So we just have to keep monitoring the progression of this wave. And then by this weekend, this is the GFS model. And this shows the development of that tropical cyclone near the northern tip of the Yucatan. And I'll show you the GFS ensembles as well. But this is the operational GFS, taking the further north track as compared to the European that weakens and really doesn't develop a tropical cyclone. It weakens that wave over the Yucatan. But the further north track of the GFS favors tropical cyclone formation. This is Saturday morning, so it could be pretty early. Just here in the next 48 hours or so, we could have a tropical depression, depending on how far north this track is. Some of the GFS members even take a tropical cyclone between Cuba and the Yucatan, and if that happens, it's likely going to be a stronger tropical cyclone that the central Gulf Coast is certainly going to have to watch as it moves north through the very warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Relatively reduced wind shear. But again, most of the models show a pretty weak tropical cyclone during most of the time. But anytime you get a tropical cyclone into the Gulf of Mexico, you got to keep an eye on it. And in fact, many of the models are showing the second wave down here to be the more formidable wave and developing a more intense tropical cyclone across the western Caribbean into the southern Gulf of Mexico. And you can still see this flow, northerly flow, getting funneled into the Bay of Tehuantepec. This has got to be a pretty windy region this time of year in southern Mexico there. I'd love to visit this area and maybe sample one of these big time fronts that are able to bring those northerly winds all the way down through the Gulf of Mexico and into the Bay of Tehuantepec there. But just look at that. Still that northerly flow. Probably are going to get a tropical cyclone that's going to develop here as well, with some cyclonic vorticity getting generated on the eastern side of those northerlies that are funneling through the Bay of Tehuantepec there. But this is the lead wave forecast to enter into the Gulf of Mexico. This is the secondary wave that's going to arrive in this region. And all of these vorticity maxima are going to one big happy family within the Central American Gyre pattern here that's forming. A lot of this is getting initiated by that Kelvin wave that has propagated across the Pacific. And this is why the National Hurricane Center has such a robust probabilities for development too. This is again the GFS. I'm not showing the European just because it's not as interesting of a solution. It has the tropical cyclone dying out over the Yucatan Peninsula. But there you can see that vortex associated with that lead tropical wave that's moving across the Caribbean Sea This is this morning. This is the tropical wave between Jamaica and Nicaragua there, Honduras on the north side. And the GFS takes this wave over the northern part of the Yucatan. Some members take it over the open water between Cuba and the Yucatan. And look at that vortex there. This GFS run definitely shows a tropical cyclone forming near the northern tip of the Yucatan and then moving into the open Gulf of Mexico, but weakening just a bit as there will be some wind shear up here in the northern Gulf of Mexico, even though the wind shear in the southern Gulf and the western Caribbean is near zero and a much more favorable area for development. The GFS takes that tropical cyclone and weakens it across the eastern Gulf of Mexico as it gets ripped apart by some wind shear. Still, though, you've got to watch this lead system. When it comes into the Gulf, it could take a slower solution, allow this wind shear to clear out of the northern Gulf. But if this pattern verifies and this tropical cyclone's weakening, then the eyes are shifted toward the next wave that's coming in. Also here in the eastern tropical Pacific, it looks like there could be tropical cyclone formation as well. There you can see that thing organizing in the eastern tropical Pacific. And what's fascinating is the teleconnections here between the tropics and the mid-latitudes with that intense blue northern cold front going south, creating a gap flow through southern Mexico into the Bay of Tehuantepec. You've got the arrival of the Kelvin wave from the west. You've got these two tropical waves from the east. A Central American Gyre forms, and you have multiple tropical cyclones getting initiated by this pattern. And I do think there's going to be an intense hurricane that's likely going to form somewhere in the western Caribbean or the Gulf. And most of the models, the GFS and the European, show this secondary wave being more formidable, arriving into the western Caribbean by about October 7 or 8 time frame. By this time, too, there's a formidable tropical cyclone forming in the eastern tropical Pacific. And when these Central American gyre patterns form, sometimes the hurricanes form down here on the Pacific side, sometimes they form on the Caribbean and Gulf side. And these model runs have kind of been meandering back and forth from those solutions. Some of the former GFS runs have shown a major hurricane in the western Gulf by this time. Others have shown one moving into the eastern Gulf. This run of the GFS, which is last night's run, shows a less favorable environment in the Gulf or the western Caribbean for a hurricane and actually has the eastern tropical Pacific dominating. But really, you don't want to get too focused on the run-to-run formation of these individual storms. You just want to know that there are two tropical waves approaching from the east, a convectively active period relative to this Kelvin wave moving across, and really warm water here too across the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. I think this lead wave, though, is going to encounter some shear in the central and northern Gulf of Mexico, which could be saving grace for the Gulf Coast with that lead system. But then we've got to watch the secondary wave approaching and even a tertiary wave after that that we need to watch very closely. So now let's look at the GFS ensembles. Basically, it shows the level of uncertainty within the GFS. So you have different members within that GFS model. We looked at the operational GFS. This is from the tropicaltidbits.com website, an incredible website operated by Levi Cohen, one of the real brilliant minds in tropical meteorology. And all of us in the weather community are incredibly thankful for Levi Cohen for producing all and making available all of these visualization tools for the tropics. But each of these little individual members within the GFS ensemble, these are all different centers of a potential tropical cyclone that form here. And the yellow colors show a deeper system, a stronger system, and not surprisingly, the further north members that are able to stay over open water and reduce interaction with land, those are the deeper tropical cyclones. But then you get some wind shear up in here. You've got a bit of a trough axis. Interesting little ridge. But the northern, one thing to note here from this GFS ensemble is that there are members that have a further north track. Many of these members that take the track through the Yucatan and Cuba have a deeper tropical cyclone, and it's possible that these could survive the more hostile environment in the northern Gulf of Mexico and potentially even reach portions of the eastern Gulf of Mexico as a tropical cyclone. These further south tracks over the Yucatan, that's similar to the operational European that take the wave over the Yucatan and really fail to develop a tropical cyclone. This one's right near the tip of the Yucatan, probably will develop into a tropical depression. And then some of the operational GFS has that system meandering for a few days across the southern Gulf of Mexico and then likely to eject somewhere off to the north, but probably it'll be ripped apart because it won't be a very intense tropical cyclone as it moves through the Gulf of Mexico, but you still need to keep an eye on that. And also this next wave that's approaching the zone as well. And here you can see a couple of these members still trying to develop earlier a tropical cyclone in the eastern tropical Pacific as well. And overall, you can definitely see this Central American gyre pattern with these individual vorticity maxima spinning around in a cyclonic fashion, almost like spokes on a wheel as they go around. And that's on Saturday, advancing just a bit. This is a GFS ensemble Monday afternoon. And this already shows a tropical cyclone forming in the heart of the Caribbean Sea to the south of Jamaica. This next wave is going to be moving into a bit more of a favorable environment, earlier formation of a tropical cyclone. And really, who knows what's going to happen with this second wave. It could easily pass to the north of the Yucatan into the open Gulf and be a pretty formidable storm. And here you can see the GFS ensemble by Monday has most of that lead tropical cyclone in the central Gulf of Mexico. The stronger ones are further south, a little bit away from the more hostile environment across the northern Gulf of Mexico. It does have some deeper lows down there as well, but most of these are weak tropical cyclones. In fact, all of these are. You don't really see a very substantial one, but if this lead wave takes a further north track between the Yucatan and Cuba, it could be a more formidable tropical cyclone here in the central Gulf of Mexico and could survive the harsh environment and then potentially have impacts across portions of the central or eastern Gulf Coast. So it definitely is important to keep an eye on this system. That's exactly why the National Hurricane Center has increased the probability of development, mostly based on the GFS package of models, whereas the European has a little bit further south track over the northern Yucatan. But the terrain over the Yucatan is not incredibly mountainous, so it's really not the type of terrain that'll just rip a storm apart, completely lose its identity. Oftentimes these tropical cyclones are able to pass across the very moist surface of the Yucatan, largely rainforest there across that peninsula, and then they can reemerge across the Bay of Campeche or the southern Gulf of Mexico and very easily ramp up once again. So I mentioned I'm really hoping that the Sarginator will be ready to go. And the Sarginator is a new probe that we are going to be deploying in the path of these hurricanes in attempt to measure the depth of the storm surge in addition to the wind and the pressure. So we're really trying to do a full court press with a hurricane deployment, trying to measure a network of subsonic sensors to track those tornado-like vortices and gravity waves and infrasound waves that are produced within the hurricane and tornadoes. We have the windy palms, which is designed to measure the strongest wind speeds that hurricanes are able to produce. It also has a pressure sensor. And then this is the schematic for the Sarginator, and this was produced by Mark, Chase, and Spin on Twitter. And basically, this is the ground or the water level, and the water level will likely rise up to this level, for example. And this is looking at it, the side of a palm tree trunk here, or it could be the side of a stilt home. And this is a sensor down here that is actually designed to go below the water. There's going to be all kinds of silicone gel that waterproofs the connections and the electronics in there. And the sensor on the bottom measures the weight of the water above it. So this is all going to be storm surge flooding. This right here is a wire that will extend up to 40 feet along the trunk, extending above it. And then this is the pack aloft, which will relay the data live through the cellular network so that we can actually see this storm surge flooding happening in real time. There's, of course, also going to be a temperature and a humidity sensor here. This is a plug-in that I'll need to be very careful. It's definitely going to be intense mounting this ahead of the hurricane. It'll be similar to the Windy Palms project where we're going to need just a little bit of time to mount this. You definitely want to mount it ahead of the storm surge as well, so we can measure that entire water rise in addition. And Hurricane Laura, they had to basically confirm the storm surge using watermarks on stilt homes and other structures that by luck oftentimes are just happen to survive that storm surge. But this right here is a design to get a network of these sensors out ahead of the storm surge, get a fine scale resolution data set of the storm surge with these hurricanes. And this is motivated by the lack of storm surge data from Hurricane Laura and other hurricanes before that, Hurricane Michael, just really depending on watermarks largely to measure this data. I know that the geological, I know that the there are some sensors that are already deployed within the creeks and certain areas that are out there that stream live data, but going out ahead of a storm and deploying these large number of storm surge sensors to get basically tighten that resolution of available data around the areas of interest, which in this case would be all along the shoreline as a hurricane is coming in. Right now, most storm chasers just deploy cameras or live streaming cameras to measure the storm surge, and many times those are ineffective or those packs are lost. But this is focused on streaming live scientific data of a storm surge happening in real time, which can also be used to save lives as people are aware of these storm surges coming in real time, and can help encourage evacuation, post-analysis. You can help use the Sarginator to help determine just how intense these tropical cyclones are when they come in. This design right here is for a stilt home, so this would be the stilt right here, but basically the same concept as a palm tree. You've got your sensor that exists below the water line that would rise up here, and then your pack and your live streaming sensor, the batteries, or the live streaming antenna, all of that then would be up on the deck up here, or at the top of the stilt above the water. So we made this 40 feet long, the wire, because the maximum storm surge is in the upper 20s of feet. That was Hurricane Katrina near Waveland, Bay St. Louis area. And so that's why we made that wire extra long, but really probably a 20-foot wire would be more than sufficient to measure the storm surge. But that's a beautiful schematic there by Mark, basically drawn on a digital napkin. And he's trying to teach me how to deploy that ahead of him. Here's some of the code that Mark has been writing to test the initial data with the Sarginator sensor, just to kind of show you the very complicated work that Mark has going on there. Not only does he design the hardware, but he also designs the software for this instrumentation, including the live streaming software as well for the Sarginator sensor. And here are some of those sensors that are coming together, and they'll actually fit inside that PVC pipe where they're going to be waterproofed. You can see those little two nodes that are extending outside of the sensor. Those are designed to measure the salinity inside the water, because salt water or brackish water or fresh water will have different pressure or a different weight, and so that will lead to an error term if we don't factor in salinity into our calculations. And so that's really the first of its kind, this sensor, to measure the storm surge height, stream it live, and with the ability to design a network of these things out ahead of the storm. So the Sarginator and our other Team Dominator science has been made possible by the Facebook supporter community. I've put a link in the text of this live stream, so if you want to become a part of our community, supporting this science, live briefings like this every day, discussing extreme weather. I'm going to roll out a storm chasing school as we conclude the tropical season here. And then every single week we're going to do a meteorology course. We'll derive equations. We'll discuss things like geostrophic balance. We'll discuss many other different types of flows. We'll even get into deriving things like the vorticity equation, the QG equations. And it's going to be enjoyable for me too to kind of refresh my meteorology. Back in 2004 or 2005 was when I took the PhD qualifier exam, and I think that was probably the peak when I knew all those different derivations and everything too. So it'll be an absolute honor to go over those again, relearn them, and then help teach them through this platform. So thank you everybody for joining me. I hope you guys enjoy my weather reports. Again, let's look at these waves. This is definitely one thing that I wanted to look at. Really quick, we can look at these two different tropical waves in the Caribbean. Here is the lead one. This is visible satellite. And right now you can see that these are just open waves. There are really no closed circulation, but you get kind of southerly flow on the east side of these easterly waves, northerly winds on the backside. Often the convection is loaded on the east side of these tropical waves. But the GFS takes a further north track than the European. The European takes us in over the Yucatan and basically dissipates it over land, but still develops that Central American Gyre that will probably produce at least a handful of tropical cyclones, some of which could move into the Gulf of Mexico. And then you could barely see the western part of that next more formidable wave that's going to be coming in, that many of the models are showing being a more substantial of a system. But this is the tropical wave that we'll be watching through the weekend, and I'm going to continue to go live through the day today, tomorrow morning, Saturday, Sunday, non-stop here in my PJs. Got my special glasses on too. First pair of glasses that I've had since losing my last pair in 2012 in a motel while storm chasing. So I just basically have been wearing disposable contacts since then. Got a -8.5 prescription, so I'm pretty much legally blind without my contacts, but it is nice to give my eyes a rest here, and I can definitely see a lot better. But I'm pure nearsighted. No signs of aging yet with the eyes, except for the occasional floater being seen. But this is that lead wave that we're going to be watching. And it'll be interesting to see which solution verifies, whether the GFS happens and we see the formation of a tropical cyclone up here near the northern tip of the Yucatan, or the worst case scenario would be between the Yucatan and Cuba, or do we see this wave just die out over the land of the Yucatan, mostly rainforest out here. Some hills as well. I don't really have a gut feeling on either one. My gut tells me that just this mean area of vorticity is going to form, and that we're going to have a couple of different potential tropical cyclones form out of it. And I think that we'll get at least one in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm just not sure whether it's this wave out here that's approaching the Lesser Antilles further out. This is the one out here, that second storm. But it's interesting to see these tropical waves just churned off the west coast of Africa through the Atlantic into the Caribbean. You've got the cold fronts coming south as we're going through fall in the United States. Some of these cold fronts make it all the way through the western Gulf of Mexico and get funneled through that gap in the terrain in southern Mexico. You've also got a Kelvin wave that's propagating from west to east across the Pacific. And all of these areas are arriving in the battle zone that is the western Caribbean, Central America, into the eastern tropical Pacific. So that's what we're going to be watching as we go through this weekend. So thank you everybody for joining me today. I'm also going to be getting the oil leak in Dominator 4 fixed today finally. I've just been adding oil the whole entire time, including when we chased Hurricane Laura. But I'm going to be fixing Dominator 4. I've got to get some new wheels too. My tires are bald. And we've got winter storm chasing ahead as well. I'm going to be chasing winter storms for Radar Omega this winter. We're still shooting our series Category 6 for National Geographic. They're editing those episodes right now as well. And I've got at least 4 or 5 episodes completed so far, tornadoes and hurricanes. If we do get another chase here, deploying the Sarginator at the end of the season, that could be an option. We're also going to be watching the fall season for tornadoes. As we go through October into November, I do expect there to be at least 1 or 2 big outbreaks of severe weather, especially after that pattern change arrives during the middle of October, which is going to be a breath of fresh air for the western U.S., the Pacific Northwest, here in the Central Rockies too, the Colorado, New Mexico, Wyoming Rockies, where there's several active wildfires right now as well. But after that middle of October pattern shift, that's when I'm really going to be watching for severe weather to ignite across the United States, including traditional Tornado Alley and down to Dixie Alley. But It's that time of year when we've got to watch the tropics, and we got to watch the mid-latitudes, and we've got to watch the potential for winter storm chasing. So again, thank you everybody for joining me. We're going to be rolling out a new Team Dominator store as well with merchandise, shirts, hats, even doggy merchandise inspired by Gizmo. So I'm excited to roll that out as well. But thank you everybody for joining me today. Have a great rest of your Thursday, and I'm going to continue these live weather reports as the Western Caribbean is starting to get really active. So thank you everybody. Dominate the storm.